Michelle.
Daniel.
OG Rose.
And today we're going to be talking about a paper called Explained and Addressed. And the basic idea is that if you come up to me and say that you're having a hard day and you wonder why you're having a hard day, and I say, well, there was this big bang and these atoms came together and some carbon molecules, and then there were some, mammals, and humans came together to form tribes, and then we had civilization, and here we are. You would kind of look at me funny. That would be an explanation for why you are here, and it would be part of the truth, the facticity that has arisen to the situation where you are here having a bad day, but you will not feel addressed. Nor you would also have this issue where that explanation is so macro, so big, that it wouldn't seem like it had anything to do with what led to you having a bad day. When somebody says they're having a bad day, usually they want to feel acknowledged, they want to feel like they're not alone, they want to feel like people are around. They're not looking for an explanation about how the universe came into existence, or even to explain the certain career choices they made that got them into a situation. Sometimes people can feel like you're not really listening to them if you go into those things. But then at the same time, it's kind of weird because you're like, well, maybe that person to give me that advice, that career advice is correct. Maybe I'm overreacting. So there's sometimes when people can be this sense that there's some kind of different way of explaining situations or dealing with situations or dealing with what people are going through, but by not having a clear understanding of differences between explain and address, it becomes difficult to articulate that feeling that there's something going on, that some of these ways that people deal with problems is not quite correct, that it's missing the mark. And hopefully the paper and the audio summary as well help to articulate differences between explain and address.
Yeah, well, I think that the approaching the topic comes from really just that sense, like you mentioned, about wanting to be understood. I think a lot of times people, there can be a lot of miscommunication in an age of not excess, but a lot of communication or a lot of access to communication with more and more people at further and further distances or close by. And so I think that it's always been befuddling to me, honestly, Daniel, when people talk about, when people who know each other and love each other have miscommunicate. It's very fascinating and very mysterious. But at the same time, I think this problem traces out what could be going on, because I think that a lot of times people feel that way because they don't feel understood, and a lot of that comes from, but obviously the people are still talking to each other, they're trying to talk to each other, or maybe they're having an argument or whatever. Right. But a lot of times what's happening is the explaining, right, and not the addressing, because explain, I think, also usually comes from I think it tends to kind of be a plastered on kind of, this is what is going on, this is what's happening and why, versus it really being kind of more exploratory or curious, which I think address tends to be, where it's like you're really kind of more seeking out that space with the person. And that's, I like how the word you use is address, because, as mentioned, like it's the actual address, the location.
Locate,
right?
Locate where the person wants to be found.
So I think there's a curiosity, and that helps with the addressing, where somebody genuinely feels addressed. It's like, it almost feels like people are not as interested. Yes, we're interested in answers, yes, but I think there's almost a way in which people feel more understood in being genuinely paid attention to, and that curiosity shows the person that I don't actually know, but I'm very eager to know. I'm very eager to understand.
Oh yeah, I think thinking about the explain address problem in terms of relationship and the idea that people think they're addressing when they're really explaining is a very interesting dynamic. And Dawood actually mentioned the problem of, when do you think you're addressing, but you might just be explaining, or vice versa. And how do you receive address, that there might also be a responsibility of the hearers. So I thought that was a great comment. And unsurprisingly from Davoud, that'd be a great comment. And it also gets into the relationship dynamics, because if we, it would be a generality, but if you associate masculine with explanation and feminine with address, which would be a generality, the male, what do you see in all the sitcom videos of the movie? That the male tends to explain situations. They say, well, the reason you don't feel good is because you didn't take that medication, so you need to take that medication. Whereas there might be truth to that, maybe taking the explanation would help, but to simply reduce the experience of not feeling good or feeling like life is overwhelming or thinking like everything is crazy, to just reduce it. There's something very reductionist down to take the pill.
Yeah.
Well, that could be a problem. Whereas, maybe one of the reasons the person even needs to take the pill is because there are some relationship dynamics that are problematic, where if those were addressed, there wouldn't be the need to take the pill. So the fact that taking the pill could improve the situation comes after. That's a whole dynamic. That's a whole situation that comes after years and years of problematic relationship disagreements or issues or conflicts that were never addressed. And so then you could have this problem where an explanation, maybe that explanation is true, maybe taking the pill would make you feel better in this context, but the very fact that it works would actually cover and hide and conceal the years and years and years of relationship dynamics that were never addressed. Mm-hmm. And then problematically make it seem like all you needed was explanation.
Yes.
That explanation ultimately was the only thing that ever could solve the problem, because it's almost like this flip moment where it reaches back in time, like we talked about in the conflict of mind, where it makes it seem as if it was always the case. Is that what you needed was the right explanation? But really there were some personal dynamics. And address is also going to be dealing with high order things. We talk about in experiencing thinking the difference between low order causality, which is I take a billiard ball and roll it across the table and hit another billiard ball, and high order causality is where I take a billiard ball, roll it across the table, it hits another billiard ball, and that makes me remember my sister who liked to play pool, and now I need to call her. There's still a causality there, but it can't be reduced to mere materiality and physicality. So likewise, a lot of stuff that happens in relationships is according to high order causality, and that cannot fit into a simple linear explanation. You're going to have to get into all the different dimensions of the person, the mind, spirit, body, soul, all the different parts. Address tends to be more holistic. At the same time, if the person does indeed need to take that medication to feel better, that explanation has value. And in fact, if the person doesn't take the pill, they may not feel good enough to enter into a headspace where they could start receiving address or doing the work of address. So it's also critical to note at the start of this conversation is we're not creating a hierarchy between explanation and address, but we're talking about the different dynamics and the need to recognize a difference between address and explanation, so that one can better identify the proper work to do at the proper time.
Yeah, certainly. And it sounded like a favoring of address when it comes to relational things, but there is undoubtedly an inextricable relationship between explain and address. Yeah. You can't have one without the other. You can't have them without them being in concert. Yeah. There's always going to be some sort of dynamic between the two.
If they're separated, address without explanation tends to be fragile. It tends to not be strong. But then explanation without address tends to be lifeless.
Exactly.
So you need both.
Right. And I think that's the reason you need both. Absolutely, you need both. And the thing with being addressed that I think the paper does a good job of is to kind of identify why that's so necessary, and why we do have a explain heavy generation, society, time. We live in a time of more explanation.
Yes.
And so we get it. There's no wonder that people can feel a greater sense of the existential questions of why do I matter? Why does life matter? Why do I exist? And not be equipped with some of the addressing elements that can really, because you can get the explanations very simply, but that's one part of it, and it's a very necessary part. But what about the why are you, like the paper talks about, why are you in this particular place? You as a particular person with particular parents or particular whatever gifts and particular circumstances, like why it just because it's every person is one of one, like we've talked about many times before. And I think the addressing really does speak to that just incredible utter uniqueness of each individual. And I think it's almost like it's if one can't be seen as their one of oneness, I think they may not feel seen at all.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, I mean, Heidegger talks about being thrown in the world, and you're thrown with these hands and these eyes and this body, and you're just here, and yet you also feel like you're not merely here, that there's this kind of weird phenomenological experience where you're in this body, but the body also isn't you. And it's this weird thing. That's not to say that your subjective consciousness is not a result of material factors, but it certainly feels like, at the very least, that the material factors emerge to you, and that therefore you cannot be reduced to those material factors, even if they're necessary. And that's all a very strange complex of terminology, but it's important to recognize as a possibility, because it certainly seems to be the case phenomenologically. That's how it feels. And so when people are explaining you by explaining your body, then you feel explained away. If they're saying, well, you're sad because of certain chemicals in the brain, well, it feels like you've explained why I feel sad, but you haven't addressed it. You've explained how my body works, but you haven't addressed my sadness. Now, again, it should be clarified that one could say, I could give you the explanation. You could say, I'm having a bad day, and I say, oh, well, you should probably drink this cup of coffee because you drink coffee every morning and you probably have a little bit of a caffeine addiction, so you need to drink this coffee and that'll make you feel better. And I stand there and say, Daniel, I didn't ask for a solution. I want you to sympathize. I want you to feel my pain. So you can use address as a kind of weapon when literally you need to go, like, that explanation was a good explanation. You need to go drink the coffee, dang it. That's why you don't feel good. So you can have this problem where you have to recognize that if someone is giving you a solution, maybe that solution actually does solve your problem, and you shouldn't respond with a certain, like, you're objectifying me by not sympathizing with what I'm feeling like. Well, maybe sometimes you shouldn't cling so hard to your feelings and get over them. Feelings are not inherently good, no more than thoughts are inherently good. It depends on what they are. But you see, right now it's like people don't tend to have a dialectic between an explain and address. People tend to really emphasize maybe addressing the emotional side, or they tend to really emphasize explaining the intellectual side, when really you need a dialectic. But I think ontologically, both of them in today's world, 2021, are under the umbrella of a materiality that reduces persons to bodies, to material causes, that then results in us being explained away. And that's what that gives us, arises to the meaning crisis that John Vervaeke discusses. But I think it's interesting to think about this in a relational context, because that then is a really good example where you have one side that's trying to help, but they're doing it in terms of explanation when what's needed is address, and then you have another side that only wants to hear address when really they need an explanation, or the other side that only wants explanation because they don't want to talk about the childhood trouble that they had that makes them emotionally off, and they don't want to address that, so they want to hide with explanation. So it's interesting to think about this in terms of a relational context, because you can see the complexity of the dialectic and the need of both sides at different times based on the situation.
Yeah, I was thinking while you're talking about, like, I wonder if to kind of continue with a analogy for the terms, if explaining could almost be like the foundation and like exoskeleton of the house or something.
Sure.
And then the addressing is like, literally the furnishings, and
I think that's fair.
Like
I think it's very fair.
Because there's something kind of similar actually in structure to things that are explanation and things that are addressing, or a type of an address, but they are very distinct. I think when you get into the very particularities of them, you can really know. It's very easy to tell the difference between the two.
Right.
And I do wonder, because maybe because we are sometimes, like, we try to want to understand. It's weird. It's almost like this desperation to understand or be understood. We kind of stay in that headspace of explanation.
Right.
And I don't want to necessarily make that dichotomy either, like, oh, explain is just head and address is heart. But I do think there's something that does feel like the address does get a little bit more into the things that are hard to articulate.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Whereas explain is going to be a lot more of the rational explanations for things.
Well, I mean, the explanation that you are sad because there is not a dopamine release in your brain would be true to you in your particularity. Even, you know, the fact that you don't have a dopamine release would be true relative to you in your particularity,
right?
But it would not address why that dopamine release is not occurring for you. So there's also a movement from the general to the particular.
Yeah, sure.
And the problem is with when we have an age of pure explanation, as the paper discusses, we're giving particular people general explanations that are true, but by not moving to the individual level, it doesn't meet them. And so it doesn't address them.
I wonder if that is also kind of connected with, we do live in an age of mass production.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
So explain or explanations, the whole reason that they are explanations and that they can be so helpful is that it's like kind of this general standard, like
they
you're
can
saying,
be externalized,
exactly,
from
extracted,
the
know, and so it's kind of like, well, that's great. We know how this particular thing needs to be assembled, so we can mass produce, hundreds of them and get them to consumers, or
and they tend to reflect a useful model. Yeah.
Right, and again, there can be some great utility and great need for that. The risk is that one can feel like just another person, not a particular person, and so the addressing is just, it's so unique too, right? Because every address is, if you look at an address on like a letter or something, it's very, there's no two addresses that are the same.
Yeah.
You couldn't send something to two addresses that are the same and expect them to go to two different places, right?
That's right.
So that's a very important thing to acknowledge about addressing and about each human and each person, is that just utter rareness, I suppose, in that individual and in their circumstances. Now the explanations are going to go with that. You have to have the explanations of how a letter gets from X to Y place, how the mechanisms of that, and all letters go through that particular process, right? But that really specific, identifier of the person or of that place, that location, and where to go to get there, it is going to be extraordinarily unique.
Well, I mean, you couldn't address anything that couldn't be explained. That wouldn't, even if you didn't know the explanation, it would have to have some explanation for how it's here in this moment of space-time as a result of X physical forces. Sure. So everything that can be addressed has a background of things that can be explained.
Sure.
The problem is that there's a transition point as you move from the general or the mere materiality to the subject, to the person, where you need to start addressing. And then you have to find this particular way of dancing between explanation and address. Like in a context of a relationship, for example, perhaps it is the case that the reason the person is unable to get out of their alcohol addiction is because they walk by the pub every single day after work, which triggers them to go in. So that's why they do it. That's the explanation. And the way they could stop their alcohol addiction would be to take a different route, to go a different way. But they're not going to be able to receive that information until you've addressed the fact that they're angry right now. For example, maybe they're angry at you, or they're angry about something. And so you could give them the explanation. And maybe they're angry about their alcohol addiction. Maybe they're angry about the fact that they do have a problem with drink. And your explanation will in fact solve their problem with drink. But because of their emotional state right now, where they feel like a horrible husband or something because they keep doing this, they're not ready to hear that explanation. So you first must address their emotional state. And maybe sit with them for 10 minutes, or take a walk, or talk about the day, do something else until they calm down, and then you can introduce the explanation. Or maybe it's someone whom you can just give the explanation straight up, because that's what they find as addressing. For them, the line between explain and address is much closer. They're most closer together, so they don't need that separation. But again, if you don't even have a distinction between explanation and address, you wouldn't even think about possibly needing to do this kind of work. Yeah, no,
absolutely. And that's why I think it's such an important concept to flesh out, because I think this is why you do see people, butting heads, or people feeling at a loss, or just very uncertain in their own existence. And I think that I think you pointed out something really important too, that it is very complex because, like you said, some people will take an explanation and feel very addressed.
Yes.
Right. Or some people will take it an address and feel like explained. Like
Yes.
it's very particular. But this is the whole thing. To have those two things working in conjunction with each other in a fruitful way, you are going to have to like know be around the
Yes.
person.
Yes.
Actually pay attention. Recognize what they see, what they receive as such or as not as such. And that can feel hard, but of course it's hard. I mean, it's kind of like relationships, friendships, relationships are difficult, but that's also what makes them so worthwhile too.
Well, I mean, you're not going to get very far in a marriage if you understand your spouse in terms of dopamine releases. Even though that is true. But if everything that happens in your day is just like, well, there was a 40% dopamine release, there was a 30%, that's not going to do too much for you. But what's crazy is that's basically how people practically act. I mean, when you say it like that, people's like, well, that's ridiculous. Aha, that's a funny. But that's basically what people do without even realizing it.
Well, when I think that's, I think some of the explain examples, you have to kind of have them be outlandish.
Yes.
Because you can recognize them as such, but that's exactly how far from the person an explanation can feel.
Yes.
Right? Even though it might not be about the Big Bang, maybe it is just an explanation that's a little closer, but it's just still not addressing them. I think that is, it's important because again, the person can still feel like, okay, that just feels so far off from who, from me and who I am or what I'm going through or what I'm trying to wrestle with or whatever. It is fascinating because like there does seem to be something, again, very locational, even phenomenological about address. Right? Because the thing is that explanations, though very useful, they don't necessarily require a cohabitation or coexistence or anything really. Like you could literally just sort of write it on a napkin and leave it at your coworker's desk or something. I don't know.
Right.
But addressing does seem to be like a dwelling with, or at least kind of a residing, perhaps in a locational proximity, maybe, I don't know.
Address almost by definition
Relationally,
must be much more relational. Now again, it becomes tricky because if very often when I address you to one person, it can sound like an explanation because it is a kind of explanation. If I'm like, well, the reason you get upset every time you miss lunch, in addition to being hangry, is the fact that your mom made a point always to have lunch and you feel like you're betraying her when you don't do lunch. Well, that sounds like an explanation, and in a sense, it is an explanation, but it's also an address. But it's more so an address because it is a situation that only arises between your particular mom and your particular person. And although it is the case that formal logic could be replicated in other particular situations, right now, right here, it refers to you in your formal situation and what you're feeling. And there's I guess another way to put it, an address is something that that cannot be found in a science textbook or cannot be found in a book in a way. An address cannot be found in a book. Like, where could I go to read a book that's going to tell me...
That's a great point.
Yeah, where could I go? What book could I go to that's going to tell me about Michelle...
Well, there's this one library in Vienna.
Oh, yeah, shoot, I meant to check that. I should have called them up. I was like, can you give me the Michelle Rose Opperman, Bob? Yeah, can you get the... Yeah, call Zeruba. Can you give me the Michelle book?
Library.
So I can know, the dynamic that's at play right here.
Right.
It is impossible to find a book about the dynamic at play right here, right now. Even if you wrote an autobiography or something, or a biography, it would not have in it the dynamics or the unfolding, tracing out of the unfolding of the conversation that's happening right here, or the hypothetical situation where you're upset about missing lunch because of feeling, like your mom's upset or something, like that hypothetical situation. It does not exist in a book. All you could find in a book are general. That maybe a book would say, hey, when people get mad, it might be because of something that happened in their past. Maybe that's what's going on, and don't ever think it's about the lunch. Maybe it has something to do with the past, right? That's what a book could tell you. So a book can give you a mental model, but it's general. It's true. No one's saying it's not true, but it's general. What you'll never find in the book is a particular story, like your particular story. In that book, I was mentioning, the hypothetical book I'm mentioning about saying you might be upset because of something that happened in your childhood. There might be case studies of 20 people who went through a similar situation, and you can use their case studies to understand why that general principle applies.
Right.
But the 20 people is versus 8 billion is not many versus the planet Earth, and certainly the live situation you're in right now is not recorded in a book.
Well, I was going to say, because be like, well, what if you write a memoir? But it's never going to be up to date. It's never going to be. There's never going to be, all of the years after you did your memoir, or like this particular situation. Yes. And you won't be able to include everything into a memoir, So it's such a good point. I think that's a really great point, Daniel. That's a great distinction to make there.
Well, and I should add before I forget, like in a particular exchange, maybe 10% of it could be found in a book, because the very base framework can be found in a book, but 90% of it is going to is too particular and too live and too now to be in a book.
That's interesting. I'm thinking now, because I don't know. Maybe this is, most people are literate, so maybe people read more now than they used to. But I do think that avid reading, like if you ask just on average, how many books do people read in a year? Mm-hmm. Right? Like it's, I don't know if it's going to break 10 or 5.
No, it does not.
Okay. Which is fine. No judgment. But the point is that I think what happens now is we used to have these sort of, kind of like places for the explanations in these books, okay? And they held almost a physical...
Kind of contained it.
Yeah, like there was a containment there, and maybe a greater recognition that that's what you were exploring, is an explanation. Explore in an explanation, okay? And then now, because that doesn't happen as much, people read... Well,
they
most
read
of they read people, right?
Yeah.
They read, instead of reading books, they read people. Like they read into people. They read into people, read into, people responding or not responding, or, and so much of people's time does, for a lot of people, it might be on social media or being on the internet in some form, right? And so I wonder...
it's like people have an itch for explanation that they would get scratched from books, and now they're going to people. But they now just place it into
people. Yeah. People become these kind of walking explanations. Like books that you can kind of just open up and sort of just read something from
because you have an itch that wants explanation, but you don't go to books, so then you reduce people to explanations to scratch that itch.
Exactly.
That's
and I think that could be why we see a favoring or a leaning towards explanation in our current age.
Well, you feel if the science, if you have science, or generally everything's telling you truth is material, then that almost gives you an ontological background to say that's the right, reading into people is what you should do. Because you've got a background that almost suggests everything is explanation. So understand people in terms of explanation.
Right. And see, the thing is, it feels so dang close, right? It feels so dang close to being addressed that it's like, what's the problem? Everyone should feel fine with this, and it's okay. But it's like, no, it's one aspect of. It's like you need both. You need both.
Well, and to Davude's comment, if you are out of habit or don't know how to hear the difference between explanation and address, well, then you're not going to be able to also speak the difference between address and explanation. You're going to blur them together and not be conscious of which one you're doing, and it's all going to get mixed up. And so then everyone's going to be reinforcing everyone else's failure to do more than just explain. And then, of course, if all of the social honors or awards or tenure or whatever are going to people who are really good at explaining, well, then you also have the social incentives that push in the direction of pure explanation and not a dialectic between explanation and address. So that makes the problem even worse.
Yeah, certainly. And I wonder too, another thing is that, I guess maybe people create content, and again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But the idea of like journaling, I'm trying to think of like avenues for addressing even your own self. Even just to have to like be alone with yourself, where you don't have any access to seeing stuff on the internet or seeing things. It's not like those things are necessarily a problem, but I think we maybe have forgotten how to address our own selves too.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
well,
because
you have to take your subjectivity and your subjectness seriously,
yeah,
and not just something. I mean, all Dr. Cadell Lass and I talk about it all the time. We exist in a society that emphasizes the objective, the objective, the material dimension of yourself, but not your subject self. You know, it's good to get a degree in math and science and the arts. Have fun at a barista somewhere. You know, you're not going to give it. But the humanities address the subject, so you're led to believe that all of that is a silly use of time, unless you're going to be a professor somewhere. So you're not going to. The humanities are basically like going to the gym for the subject. And if you don't engage in the humanities, well, then your subjectness, your personness gets out of shape. And then it doesn't have a shape. And when it doesn't have a shape, it doesn't have a form. And it's not there. It becomes a blob. And so then, yeah, we're not addressed because we're just blobs. We're out of shape.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I wonder with like this idea of being, I don't know, I keep on thinking about being understood. I wonder if, I don't know, I keep on thinking, like, you know, Bernard, you and I would talk a lot about empathy. I wonder if empathy is a big part of being addressed, because, like, if you want to address something or address a person, you know, if you think about it, a physical address, you'd actually have to, like, walk there or, like, go there, you know, so you have to, like, allow yourself to go. I mean, it's the other thing, if reading it doesn't happen as much, you know, you used to, you know, even like literature, you're kind of walking in someone else's shoes or walking through their life. So empathy does seem to be big on addressing.
Oh, well, huge. I mean, if we take the On Critical Thinking paper seriously, then empathy and critical thinking are extremely tied together.
Yeah.
Where in critical thinking, because in empathy, you're not just feeling the same sentiment as another person. You are literally trying to enter into their very immanent and metaphysical framework by which they understand the world. And that is a radically difficult act of thought.
Yes.
Like to put your feet in another person's shoes as opposed to your shoes in another person's shoes, to really see the world through their eyes versus see through their eyes through your eyes. You know, it's like you tell yourself you're seeing through their eyes, but really you're seeing through your eyes as you understand their eyes. You know, to really see through their eyes.
It's a total suspending of judgment, I think.
It's very difficult, and I think it's the correct understanding of critical thinking, where critical thinking and empathy go together. Well, in order to address someone, then you have to somehow be in their location. But of course, you can't literally occupy the same location as another person in space and time. So how can you be in someone's address? You know, if address means location, how do you do that? Well, you have to be you have to abstract reason. You have to abstract yourself from yourself, use critical thinking, and do everything in your power to really, really, really see the world through their eyes and not your own, because it is only by doing so that you have any chance of having a sense of how they understand the world, so that you can address that understanding. If you don't understand their understanding, well, then you can't address it, and you can't address them. So it requires empathy. It's a massive, and empathy is not just an emotional thing, although it entails emotions. It becomes this very strong intellectual act that is more full-bodied. So yes, I think associating with an address is correct.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, too, it's like a combination of empathy and then also realizing, like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, of curiosity, right, where you just, there's a real sense of, like, in addressing, to kind of give the space, right, create the space for what the person wants to be able to share. Because again, you're not going to really know, you know, like even in the most recent LAC talk you had with Dr. Goodell and Ebert and Adlin, like Dr. Goodell mentioned how you can never really, really get behind what a person, you know, really deep into that person, behind the layers that they have. Right. So really the best you got is like to just give them the space to be able to let them share it themselves. Because, you know, you'll always be kind of playing a semi-guessing game. Right?
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
So I think curiosity and empathy probably are two good ingredients.
Well, and to the point, I mean, the very fact that there's always going to be this certain element where you can't totally occupy them means that full addressment might be, in some degrees, is impossible. There's always some element of failure in address. But in explanation, it feels like you succeed. So then you can see why the temptation is there to make everything explanation, because it feels much more like you're succeeding when you just explain, because you can see how the parts fit together in physicality.
Exactly. And that does feel more mechanistic,
Yes.
like machinist.
And a machine isn't hidden from you, like consciousness.
Yes.
So a machine, wouldn't it be lovely if everything could be explained, because nothing would be hidden. And that would take out the existential, that would take out the uncertainty.
We wouldn't be
yeah, we wouldn't be human, we'd be bodies, of course. But you can see why the temptation to explain away the person is there.
Absolutely.
Because there's always
an... so complex and nuanced and...
Because it is.
And difficult,
Yes. Well, if literature is just pleasure, well, good. It's just for pleasure. But once you start talking about literature somehow capturing the situation of humanity and all the complexities of different worldviews colliding and value systems coming together and people misunderstanding one another even though they love one another, and how love can be a force of destruction when it's not balanced with truth and goodness, and how beauty can tempt people into no, forget all that. No. So we want literature to just be pleasure,
right,
as opposed to some sort of map of the human condition.
Yeah.
And so likewise, we want humans to just be explainable, because once you say they have to also be addressed, everything becomes far more difficult.
Yes.
And it's not that the requirements of thinking, it's not like they go up from 1 to 2. They go to 1 to like 40. Like they really go up a lot, and you introduce a whole lot more uncertainty into your world, a lot more not knowing if you're doing a good job or not, because there's so many more things you have to do. When there's just one thing you have to do, explain, you can have more of a sense that you're doing it right. But when you take address seriously, and then of course the dialectic with explanation, so you have to do them both, there's many more areas you can in your life, or many more things you have to do that you can question if you're doing them right. And so then you can have an existential element that comes into play.
Yeah, I was, as you were talking about, when you say many more things, do you think that maybe has more to do with just the development of self, apart from relations, that then it's going to come out as a, basically like you are maybe more ready or more equipped for the ability to address and have the dialogue.
Yeah, you've got to do a lot more self-work. You have to pay attention
right,
to a lot more dimensions of them. You can't just reduce what they're feeling to a lack of having a cup of coffee, even though that might be the cause of it. You have to take that seriously. You have to also, you can't simply pay the bills. Like, you were mentioning just because you have a house doesn't mean you have a home.
Right,
and so you have to do the work of creating a home. Well, what in the world does that mean? Like, what's the difference between house and home? We can say it.
Like, people could have different definitions
of
that,
of what a home is, based on different traditions or different love languages. And now you got pages to the love languages. How for them, conversation is love, and for you, it's gifts. And now there are all these different dimensions. Like, the moment you say there's a difference between a house and a home, I'm sure everyone who hears that says, yes, there is. But now let's ask them to explain it. There's a sense we know there's a difference, but then it's like, well, what is it? And I was like, crap, that's really hard. It's not easy. And then people will say, well, love, and you feel at peace. It's like, okay, well, what is love? What if the other person doesn't interpret what you think is love as love? And what do you mean by peace? Like, people know on like just a instinctual level that there's a difference between house and home. In the same way that when you say there's a between explanation and address, I bet a lot of people go, yes, there is. But then when you say, well, explain home, explain address, it becomes really more difficult. Because in that very sense of the difficulty is a revelation about the complexity. It's a revelation that you are now dealing with a high order. But precisely because it is a high order causality, just precisely because it is complex, we have like the space by which we can deny it. We can say it's not there because it's so complex that it can't be reduced to a single variable. Well, the fact that it can't be reduced to a single variable, we can say is evidence that it's not there. And then go back to our happy life of just pure explanation, where it's not so happy though, because here's the thing. Here's the problem. Like, pure explanation will give you a stability, or what someone like C.S. Peirce it looks like Pierce, but it's Peirce, he calls fixed belief, where it will give you like a sense of a fixed belief. But eventually, the fact that you need to be addressed comes to get you. And you start facing the mental health crisis and the collapsing relationships or different things. The world of pure explanation can work for a little bit, can get you by for a time, but eventually the parts of people that are, I guess, then repressed, if we use that language, that psychoanalytical language that's repressed, eventually comes out. And it needs to be addressed.
Right, and that's what I was thinking too. Explained it does seem to err on the side of repressing.
Yes. And denying there is a person.
Right, and addressing is to really kind of acknowledge and recognize that and give space for that to be spoken or shared.
Yes. Now, as you know, there could be a danger where people use their subjectivity as kind of like, I feel this way, therefore you owe me. You know, people can use their personhood as a bargaining chip to getting them some sort of leverage or whatever. So this distinction between address and explanation does require a certain level of responsibility of people to not use the fact that they need to be addressed as a bargaining chip against other people to get their way.
I wonder if that sort of suddenly kind of falls into like explanation though, like, or ego.
It can.
You know, because it's not that I would not link up explanation with ego necessarily, but there can be something where it's more of it's doing it as kind of it's using it. I don't want to say manipulate's too strong of a word, but.
Oh, I mean, you could use the subjects of address in the form of explanation, right? So, yes, that's absolutely the case, where you can say, I am a person that I feel upset because you didn't do this for me, so I'm actually explaining something, therefore you need to do something. So, yeah, that's very true. It's using the material of address, but it's actually using it in terms of explanation.
Yeah. I think too, like, I think the paper does a really good job of making it very, very clear and very concrete, kind of what the distinctions would be between explanation and address. And I think when you start to see that, it starts to become more clear, and then you are equipped with the language, really to talk about what is this disconnect that we can have in our communication. Or in how we engage with information we are presented with, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, and that's the other thing, too. In an information-heavy time, that tends to be explanation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You know, which, again, there's a place for that. But what does it mean for you particularly?
Right.
You know, or what do you even have to do with that information particularly?
Right.
And if it's confused, then you can start to kind of orient yourself towards explanation and information. Not that those are exactly the same thing, but you get what I'm saying. As if it is address, it should like kind of locate you, right?
Oh yeah,
and it kind of does, but it kind of doesn't. And I think you have to be having that understanding and almost understanding of separation between the two is important, because then you can kind of be more freed, I think, from the grips of certain explanations for things, if that makes any sense.
Well, if you have an age of pure explanation, then you're going to still have the needs of address, and you're going to have to look for them in explanation. And when it doesn't provide them, well, all you know what to do is to look more into explanation. Maybe it must have been the wrong explanation, so you do more explanation. You just go more and more explanations for things. And information almost by definition must present itself in terms of explanation.
Sure.
Because how can someone on the internet write a blog about your life?
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to find on the internet a blog about the conflict you're having right now with your spouse. You know, maybe you'll find various guides.
It's over the clown costume, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. We're waiting
really...
for someone to write a blog on the clown costume from episode 12. So
that's why we're in a fight
waiting
over the clown costume.
for someone to do that work.
That's our dispute. We'll confess.
Well, you know, but no, so you're not going to find online a blog about your story.
But that's weird, though, because a blog still can make you feel related to, even though it's not your particular story, it's someone else's.
Sure, a good writer will make you have inklings of being addressed.
Yes.
But to get to the deepest level of address, it has to be on the particular, between you and yourself, or you and the person you are with, and it has to be located in that relationship.
Yeah.
But this is where, you see, what's interesting, it's like you have a gradient, where explanation is on one side and address is on the other.
Yeah.
And it's like a movement from left to right, where a thing can say, 20% address you and 80% explain, or 90% explain, 10% address. So something like a good blog that really hits you, perhaps it's like it's 60% addressing and 40% explaining. But to really feel addressed, to get to that 90 realm, it would have to be located in the particularity of your relationship.
Right.
But if you don't even have the language of the distinction between explain and address, it's all just going to feel like explanation to you, and you're going to feel like there must be something wrong with me when I read about dopamine and I don't feel like that solves my problems. You know, if you can't,
Right.
because it's presented to you as if you're made to feel in an age of pure explanation that all explanations are equal. All are good, and they should make you feel, and they should work for you.
Exactly.
What's wrong with you if they don't work for you? What's wrong with you? There must be something wrong with you if these explanations about dopamine releases corresponding with sadness, if that's not enough to make you feel better, there must be something wrong with you.
And there's another explanation, right? That
Yes.
it's like, if you don't get the explanation, then the explanation is that you have a problem.
Yeah, that's
Or
correct.
something's wrong with you, like you said. And I think that's very interesting, because of the word has like X in it, the extricating, the explicating, all of it. There's something that does seem to kind of make divisions
Yes.
about it, which can be very necessary, but at the
Sure.
same time can leave one feeling very divided and distant from whatever the thing that they're trying so hard to figure out is. And like that explanation is offered to help them understand, but yet they're like, it's almost just like, I think there can be a desperation to be, to truly be seen, to be heard. And I think that's what can be lost with explanation.
Well, explanation deeply links itself in the direction of technology.
Yeah.
Medicine is a technology, internet is a technology, all these different things. And in an age of pure explanation, people think about their personal problems in terms of what technology do we need to fix it, what pill do we need to take, what medicine do we need to take, maybe we need to get separate self, like there's like technological thinking really permeates the life.
What app can you get that will solve your problem?
You need to meditate, so what app can you download?
What meditation app?
What meditation app? So you need to focus, so what because you have attention deficit disorder from being on your computer so much, so what app can you add to your computer to help with your attention deficit disorder? So everything in an age of pure explanation, we look for technological solutions. We don't look for human solutions. We don't look for how humans can get along better without introducing a technological element. We don't try to think about what makes a human unique from, say, a robot or an animal, or a whale or something, that would contribute to why they have this unique phenomenological experience that contributes to them thinking and feeling certain ways versus others. When you take address seriously, you take the human very seriously, and the human condition and how the human operates. And you also understand that not all human problems can be answered with technological responses. But the fact that everyone generally turns to technology to deal with their problems, either to run from them, to heal, to get treatment for them, or whatever, suggests that you have a tyranny of explanation, that it is out of a dialectic with address, so it is out of balance.
Yes.
And as a result, it's causing suffering, because then explanation has this kind of totalitarian tendency.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Oh, I agree.
Where
totally.
address, on the other hand, can be more address that falls out of a dialectic with explanation can become more anarchist. It can become more individual and kind of separated and tribal. So that can be a problem. And also address, like we mentioned before, can be fragile. Like you believe that the world was created a certain way by a god, and then you get certain scientific information that then can kind of shatter that, right? It can be more fragile. Whereas if you figure out how to blend explanation and address, you can get something that's used to Leap's language and open and anti-fragile. It can develop and change relative to new information. So explanation tends to have this totalitarian tendency, where address can have an anarchist tendency. But if you put them in dialectic, they can balance.
Right, and that's the thing. I think ultimately, as a dialectic, there's a great place for both.
Yes.
A very necessary place for both.
Well, basically, a very large amount of our work is basically arguing that pure anything is bad. Just any pure anything is bad. Even when you get into the three infinites, like truth, beauty, and goodness, if they're not together, Beauty can become a problem because it can lure people into things that aren't true and good. Truth without beauty can be a problem because it's lifeless. And good, and beauty or truth without goodness, well, who cares? It's bad. It can be evil. So even the infinites, the classical infinites, have to exist, cannot exist alone. They have to exist in a concert with the other three. So basically pure anything, non-dialectical anything becomes very, very problematic. And you can even take that to, if you follow the Christian conception of God, God is a trinity. It's a one essence, multiple persons. So you don't even have a hard unity or a hard singular principle located in the Christian God. So it basically all becomes dialectic, but then the question becomes, what is the art of dialectic?
Yeah.
How do you live? What is the art form of the dialectic in the relationship that you live in a manner to move between address and explanation? Well, to start, there generally tends to be a tendency of one member in the relationship to lean too far on the side of explanation, and the other member tends to lean too hard on the side of address. If both recognize the need for the other, that can start to have them walk in step with one another as part of a dance. So that's just recognizing the difference can be a useful step.
Yeah, and I don't know. My mind keeps going back to just the words themselves. There's just something about, like, if you go to a place, you've kind of found this. You have this little address. You go on your bike and, I don't know, some countryside in France, and you go to this little, chalet, and you park your bike, and you trace your hands on the rock wall on the way up to the front door and things like that. Like, there's something so embodied about addressing, right? Like, there's just something so like, come and experience, come and see for yourself, come and, open the door, hear it creak as it opens, step into the space, smell the aroma and see the way the light goes through the windows and things like that, that I think is what we really are desperate for in terms of people experiencing our souls, experiencing who we are. And yes, there's always going to be the mystery and the layers that can never be maybe penetrated or, taken off necessarily. But there's still just I think that exploratory place of being addressed and being really experienced that I think is so crucial and so physical, truly.
Yeah.
And I don't mean just physical in terms of, like, my hand on your knee or something like that. Like, it's also a physical of the moving through space and time of that person's, like, history, their experiences, what they've been through, or what they love, things they love,
right.
All of that. So I think, again, it's such a multifaceted thing. To be addressed is not going to be, I think that's another thing too, where being addressed is kind of seeing, like you said, it's much more holistic and it's much more experiential in that way. And the explanation is, again, it's great because you need to be able to, right? You need to be able to know how to get, you might, like a map, for example, that never changes. It's just there. That helped you on your bike in, the countryside in France to get where you were trying to go, right? You needed it, but you would never have, like, the richness without the actual experiencing of that address.
Absolutely. I mean, address is far more phenomenological than explanation, and explanation is far more analytical.
Yes.
And the trick is to be an analytical phenomenologist per se, to find that balance. No one wants to live in a world of pure explanation. They want to be able to feel the wall. They want to smell. They don't want to live in a world where they receive facts about smells and they learn about smells. They want to smell. We don't just want information, we want experiences, of which entail information. But information doesn't necessarily entail experience.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
if explanation does not arise to address, well, then it's one-dimensional. But then address without explanation is not grounded in anything and just flies off.
Right.
Today, I think we err too far on the side of explanation, and we need to arise to address. We need to not just learn the facts of what things smell like, but we actually need to smell them. We need to not just learn facts of what things look like, we need to observe them, which is the only way to fully honor them as well.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Well, thank you, everybody.
Well, thank y'all.
If you want to read the paper, you can go to our Medium page. You can read the paper there. It's really great. And then also on the YouTube, we have a summary there of the paper. I think that's a great topic, Daniel, so thanks for fleshing it out.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for talking, I think, situating it in the context of a relationship, since the paper is more macro, kind of ontological. The relationship is where it's interesting, because you have hiding address and explanation, hiding explanation, so on and so forth. These dynamics are really fascinating, so I think it was good to go there. So for more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com. YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Anchor, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.